Okay, Daniel chapter 8 is, as we looked at last week in the general outline of it, describes for us the next two periods of history involving Israel and the surrounding nations there. And the two nations that are mentioned here are, the explanation is given for us of who they are. And in verse 20, Gabriel said, the first animal, which was the ram standing by the river Ulai that Daniel saw, said, and had two uneven horns, the last one coming up and being higher than the other one, that is the Mede in the Persian Empire. We've already seen this introduced earlier in a couple of visions that Daniel has had. So this one involves the Medes and the Persians. And then the other empire is represented by the male goat, which comes flying in from the west and with great fury and rage attacks the ram and completely obliterates him. And then out of that kingdom arises, and he's represented as having just one horn, and that horn is broken off, and then four others spring up in its place. And we're told in verse 21 that that kingdom is the kingdom of Greece. So these are two kingdoms that are back to back, that are in the next realm of the historical information that is given to Daniel. And as we saw in this passage here also, there is, in this passage of Scripture, there's some elements here that go beyond just what's going to happen in the next couple of centuries in the region regarding Israel and its neighbors. And that we'll see later on, not tonight, that some of those things are significant. They're going to be fulfilled in Antichrist, who is yet to come. Now, it's interesting that in Daniel 8, what Daniel is really focusing in on, or given more information about, is the Greek Empire. And this will come back again in Daniel chapter 11. And there's a reason why there needs to be an understanding about the Greeks. Daniel at this point really could care less who they are, because they're just an empire over towards the other side, the northwestern part of the Mediterranean in relation to where Daniel is. They're just an empire, the small one that's kind of a thorn in the flesh, but they don't really have much impact on anybody else. They're kind of just doing their thing over there. But yet what happens is that by the time of Jesus Christ, the New Testament is written in a common language that is spoken called Koine Greek. So how do you go from being a nation of Hebrews living in the Far East, speaking a language of people called the Greeks, who live in relatively, in distance-wise from where you are in Israel, across the ocean and to the north, and you've had no contact with them up to this point? Well, part of what Daniel is being told here is leading up to that establishment, and fits into an explanation of how we end up by the time of Jesus, the New Testament being written in Greek, which had become a global language, so to speak, trade language at this point, and yet the empire that was ruling at that time is Roman. So we'll see some of that explained for us, how it comes about in Daniel chapter 8 here and in Daniel chapter 11. So what I want to do tonight is start with back here in Daniel chapter 8 in verses 20 and 21, where we find the succession of empires being introduced and told to us in this vision. And the explanation that is given to us by Gabriel is what we just referenced here. So let's begin in verse 19. Actually, we'll read down through verse 22. And what we want to take note here is, what is then the historical record that we find since Daniel's time that confirms what he is told here? So verse 19, Gabriel said, "Look, I'm making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for at the appointed time the end shall be." So these events are leading to the fulfillment of all that God has said regarding human history. That's the culmination at the end of all of what Daniel is seeing. And in verse 20, "The ram which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia." Now, go back in this chapter and look at verse 3 rather. He says, "Then I lifted my eyes and saw there standing beside the river was a ram which had two horns. The two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last." Okay, so the first thing about this empire is you have one empire that's existing. You've got a second one that obviously is coming up. And according to history, what we find is that the Medes were a people that occupied pretty much the northern part of Iran. And the Persians were a group of people that occupied the southern part of Iran. And in 549 BC, the Medes were conquered by the Persians. Now, why is that important to know the date at which the Medes were conquered by the Persians? Well, the Medes were the ones that were first the rulers. Then the Persians come along and conquered them. So you have on the one side the horn of the ram, that is the Mede Empire that is in existence. And then you have the Persians that come along conquering them, and that's how you have the description of the higher horn that rises up because it came last. However, the date of 549 is significant because this date of the Medes being conquered by the Persians is within a year or two of Daniel receiving this vision, of finding out this information. Again, Daniel is in Babylon. He's not over in Susha. He's not at Shushan the palace. He's not at the citadel that was the capital of the Persian Empire. But he is aware of the Persian Empire. And so it would be recognizable to him, the names that are given to him here, as an existing kingdom. But the ones that were the main force at this time regarding these two nations was the Medes. So within a couple of years of Daniel 8, we find that the Persians overtake, they conquer the Medes. Then that combined kingdom we find in 539 BC then conquered Babylon. That's Daniel chapter 5. And that's when conquering Babylon, then Babylon came under the rule of the Medes and the Persians. So glance over at Daniel chapter 5 again, real quickly here, and we find that in verse 30, it says of Daniel chapter 5, that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, who was a Babylonian, was slain. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Okay, that's the establishment or the conquering of Babylon by the Medo-Persian Empire. So what we see in Daniel chapter 5 is the culmination of what is presented in Daniel chapter 8 regarding the Persian Empire. So it comes into force, it reigns. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the Persian Empire is that there is a bit of bad blood that exists between the Persian Empire and the next one that is to come, Greece. Now, to see this, if you notice back in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 7, that Daniel says he saw a goat, and this goat was confronting the ram. And the goat moved against the ram with rage and attacked the ram. Now, it is purposeful that we find in this vision that this is ascribed to the ram, that he was being, or the goat, that the goat was attacking the ram with great rage. Not just simply because it was, two males that were combating here for the rights to the herd. That's not what's going on here. In fact, there are no other critters that are mentioned in this other than the ram and the male goat. But the male goat comes with great speed and with rage and attacks the ram, the Medo-Persian Empire, which indicates to us that God is saying there's some motive behind this. There's a reason why this goat, which represents the Greeks, as they come and attack the Medes and the Persians, is upset. And he's not just a little upset, he's very upset. So there's been some bad blood that's been building here. What do we find from history? Well, in 490 BC, we find the beginnings of what was called the Persian Wars. And in this, Persia attacked Greece. They went over there and they lost. It was at the Battle of Marathon that they lost. Then there was kind of a continuing skirmish that happened, and in 480 BC, Xerxes I again attacked Greece, spent a whole bunch of money, put the kingdom, or used up the money of the kingdom of Persia trying to conquer Greece, and did not succeed. And because there's been this skirmish going on between Persia and Greece, there's been this increasing animosity on the part of the Greeks towards the Persians. Now, the Greeks had won, and what we find from history is interesting, is that when Alexander the Great assumed the kingdom of Greece, he used as a campaign point in order to conquer the Persians the earlier battles that Greece had fought with Persia, and kind of drummed up the national support to go over there and conquer the Persians because they came over and caused us problems. And it worked. Because when Alexander then moved against the Persians, he came as one who was leading a group of people that were intent on dealing a final blow to the Persians for what they had done earlier. And so we find that when it comes to the Persian Empire and their reign, from about 549 until, into 200 years later, the Persian Empire was a pretty successful outfit. Under Darius the Great, the Persian Empire extended all the way from what today is the coast of Turkey and Greece. It extended south into Egypt. It extended all the way east to the Indus River Valley in India. And from Susa, the capital, running west, the Persians built a road which went all the way to what is into Turkey today. Sardis was the city. And it made a direct connection between the Mediterranean and that which was down in the Gulf area over there in the southern part. And it allowed them to develop a postal system. The Persians were the first ones that did this. So it was a pretty extensive, pretty successful empire. That was the Persian Empire. That's why you find here this ram is described in verse 3 as standing beside the river, the capital of Persia, and he's kind of enjoying life is the picture, because it was a successfully established empire that did have great import. Then in verse 21, we find that we're told that the Greeks appeared. And according to history, what happens here is that in 338 BC, so about 200 years after The Medes were conquered by the Persians. You have Macedon conquered the Greek states. And this begins what is called the Hellenistic Period. This was a time frame in which Greek culture expanded across all of the known world here in the Middle East, took their ideas with them, and integrated them into the countries that they conquered. And this is where we find the beginnings of the spreading of not only Greek thought, but Greek art, Greek plays, writings, the Greek language. And this was necessary this was essential in order to begin to spread the common speaking of Greek across this region, so that by the time of Christ, when the New Testament is written, it's written in the Greek language. How this happened is that in 336, Alexander became king. Now, his father, Philip of Macedon, had begun to conquer some of the Greek states because they had been squabbling with each other for a long time. Persia had been interfering. He saw the opportunity, so he conquered Athens. He conquered, Thebes, I believe it was. And as a result, he ended up bringing together the squabbling Greek states under one kingdom. However, he was assassinated after or during a battle, became the newly minted king of Greece. And so in 336, Alexander becomes this single horn that is depicted on this male goat. And in verse 5, Daniel says, I was considering, and suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth. Without touching the ground, the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. An unusual feature for a goat, because a goat usually has two of them, and they're between their ears that are horns. In this case, he only has the one, and so he looks like a goat rhinoceros, which is kind of a weird creature. But the significance is that this kingdom is being led by a single ruler who is effective in being able to sweep across the country swiftly. And historically, we find that's exactly what happened with Alexander. In 334, he began the push against Persia. And he had an army that was well organized, well set up, and highly efficient. His father had done this, but Alexander showed a brilliance as a general and as a commander, and took what his dad had done and just expanded it out. And one of the things that the Greek army did was they gave up using a 7-foot spear and went for a 20-foot spear. Now, the purpose of that was they took that spear then and gave it to the guys on the front of the line as they were marching. And when they tipped that spear out, if they're holding the back end of it, you've got 15 feet of spear in front of you. What it was effective was against horsemen, because that spear could reach out and get at the heart of the rider on the horse, or the horse, and destroy the horse, and then you've got a fallen soldier that can be dispatched. But if you see an army approaching you with 15 feet of pointed spear at you, it makes it really difficult as a foot soldier to get in and conquer them. It became a very effective maneuver. But not only that, Alexander would, in battle, create a diversion in which it would split the opposing army in the middle. And once that little gap was open, he would rush in with these soldiers with a 20-foot spear and then start clearing out the middle and bringing them, rest of them from around on the side, and basically would decimate the army, the opposing army, from inside out. So he became very, very successful, oftentimes winning battles with odds of 10-1 on numbers. In fact, when he went against Persia, the king of Persia at that time was Darius III, and he had close to 2.5 million soldiers. In the battle that Alexander went up against him, he only had like 50,000. So this guy was a brilliant strategist. And he quickly conquered the Persian Empire. And in 330 BC, Alexander the Great of Greece took over the Persians. So 200 years after Daniel receives this vision, we find that in verse 21 and 22, when you have the description of the Greeks arising and the first king being the significant one that leads the charge and overtakes them, it's 200 years down the road. But it happens like God said. The swift move from the west, led by a singular king, and the Persians are conquered. Well, as we read the narrative, we find that in verse 8, that the male goat grew very great, conquered everything that was known of the Persian Empire, and was pushing even farther. And then, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken. And the description that's given here is that something happens that is unexpected. And what was unexpected was that Alexander was in Babylon in 323 BC, 7 years after conquering the Persians. And in 323 BC, he died. It's an illness that is left up to the mystery of history. How's that? Mystery of history. Today, there have been some guesses about what may have happened with Alexander. The record describes that he died after a sustained time of a fever. But there may have been a possibility that he contracted a bacteria which then developed into an autoimmune response system within his body that slowly paralyzed him to death. Because some of the accounts talk about the fact that he was still cognizant but couldn't move up to the time of his death. But in 323 BC, he died. And what we find according to history then happens exactly the way that God said. Look at verse 8. It says, after the large horn was broken, in its place of it, 4 notable ones or horns came up toward the 4 winds of the heaven. Okay, what are the 4 winds of the heaven that are referred to here? The 4 winds of the heaven refer to the directions that we are accustomed to as we live here on earth. The way we determine the directions that are used today is based on a significant star that is used to navigate by. It's called the North Star. And it's been used for centuries. But it's been used because if you navigate according to the North Star, you're going to be heading what direction? You're going to be heading north. And based on that, the compasses or the compass points that we find on Earth are north, and then opposite of us is south, and then east and west. So the 4 points or the 4 things here of the winds under the heavens would describe the fact that you've got some expansion that's going out north, south, east, and west. So Alexander dies. After he dies, the kingdom was passed on to his descendants. But people weren't happy with that. And very quickly, 2 of his sons were killed off, and then 4 generals rose up and took over certain parts of the kingdom. And so to the west, you had a small kingdom over in Greece that was composed of the small state kingdoms of Greece and a little bit of Asia Minor around Turkey. That was the kingdom of the west. Then there was another smaller kingdom that happened to arise to the east of that. And then there were 2 major kingdoms that came up. The 2 major ones we need to know are to the north and the south. The southern one was Egypt and Cyprus. It was ruled by Ptolemy. The Ptolemies then established a dynasty along with Cleopatra, and that became significant to the south. Just note that. But the kingdom to the north is called the Seleucid kingdom. And that kingdom to the north is Iran, Syria, parts of Iraq, and the reason it's significant is because of what comes out of it. So this kingdom to the north then is one of the four. It's one of the bigger ones. But it's one that we find here in the prophetic history then has impact upon Israel. And that impact is what we see in verse 9. And out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south. Okay, so that means that this horn that arises up is to the north of the land of Israel. It's part of the northern kingdom of these four, and it expands southward. What we're going to find, according to the historical record, the king that is described by this moved against Egypt, which is to the south. He also moved toward the east, which would be the remnants of the Persian Empire and India and beyond. We find that not only that, but he moved toward the glorious land, verse 9, which is a reference to Israel. Make sure that we understand that Daniel, as he's been given information about this little horn here of the Grecian Empire, this is one that arises out of the remnants of the Grecian Empire, which will remain until about 31 BC. And this Grecian Empire covers all of the old Persian Empire and a bit more. And it spreads throughout the empire Greek thought, Greek writing, Greek art, Greek speech, so that the goal of this empire and this time is the spread of Hellenistic culture. If you look in history, this time period is called the Hellenistic Period. And the results from this have remained unto this day. Because some of the responses and the thinking that we have are influenced by Greek thought and Greek things from this time period. But the goal of this time frame was to spread Hellenistic thought. Now, the unique thing about this is that before this, most kings in their relationship to the nations in this time period were allowing them to continue with their culture. They weren't trying to change them. But something happens with this one who is the little horn that arises, in which he exceeds what anybody else has done, with the intent of making them Greek like no one else has. You know, it almost has shades of what Hitler tried to do with Aryanism and the spread of trying to make Aryanism as a supreme race. This little horn wanted to make the Greeks supreme and change everybody to be what the Greeks were. Now, with that thought in mind, let's distinguish here what Daniel talks about as being the little horn in Daniel 7:9, and the little horn that he sees in Daniel 8:9, and the little horn that Daniel sees in chapter 7. Now, if you remember Daniel chapter 7, look at verse 8. Daniel 7:8. Daniel says, I was considering the horns, the 10 horns of this beast, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. Okay, the question arises, does the little horn Daniel see in Daniel 7:8, is it the same as the little horn in Daniel 8 and verse 9? Well, let's briefly look at what information we have about these two to see if they are the same thing. Because if they're not the same thing, we need to make sure we put them into the right framework of history. What we've determined from Daniel chapter 7, the little horn that he sees is Antichrist. Okay, he's the figure that appears at the end of time who is who reigns and rules over mankind ruthlessly and persecutes the Jews. So in Daniel 7, you have the Antichrist being mentioned. As such, he arises out of the fourth kingdom, the last kingdom that reigns on earth. He is of the 10 horns. He arises out of those 10. He conquers 3 of the 10. And he's one that in reigning over all of mankind, we find that he persecutes Israel for a specific time period of 3.5 years. Okay, that's the Antichrist of Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 8, the little horn of Daniel, is one who arises from the second of 2 kingdoms here. Okay, the first, in Daniel chapter 7, verses 8 and 9, it says the little horn was broken, and in place of it 4 notable ones. And out of one of them came a little horn. And so he arises from the second of these 2 kingdoms that are described, the Greeks. And in so doing, he is described, this little horn, as being the 5th horn that appears in the Greek kingdom. Okay, again, a little bit of difference here, don't you see? Daniel 7, the little horn arises out of the 10. Daniel chapter 8, he arises out of the 4 of the Greek kingdom. So there's a specific origin here that's given to Daniel 8, the little horn. He is Greek. That gives us a hint to where to look to find out who this guy might be. It also places him earlier in history than the Antichrist. Because the Antichrist is part of a kingdom that is yet to come. We're not in the 4th kingdom that Daniel sees in Daniel chapter 7. That is yet to come. We also find that the little horn of Daniel chapter 8 does persecute Israel, but it's for a longer time period than the little horn of Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 8, verse 13, you have a number that's mentioned which says, how long, middle of the verse, will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices, the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? In Daniel 8:14, the answer is for 2,300 days. Then the sanctuary will be cleansed. Okay, that's a longer time frame than 3.5 years. And so the significance of what happens here is that there's a difference in which you find something occurring in the temple of Jerusalem done by one who is a Greek. Again, it's significant because if God is saying this happens for a time period done by a Greek, we begin to narrow down where we're going to look in history to find who this individual might be. But we also must remember that while Daniel 8 describes a different little horn, there are characteristics of this horn that also apply later to Antichrist. But this is not the Antichrist who is to appear later on. Daniel 7 is that Antichrist. Well, we find that Daniel, in Daniel chapter 8, does give us some descriptions of this individual who is the little horn. So let's look at some of the things that are mentioned about him in Daniel chapter 8. Beginning at verse 10, it says of the little horn, it grew up to the hosts of heaven, and it cast down some of the hosts, some of the stars to the ground, trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth to the ground. He did all this and prospered. And then there's a time frame mentioned in verses 13 and 14. Now, what's described here in Daniel chapter 8 is then amplified for us in verses 24 and 25 by Gabriel. So Gabriel says of him, his power shall be mighty, verse 25, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully and shall prosper and thrive, and he shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. One of the characteristics is that this individual is going to have an extremely cruel streak. And it's not only a cruel streak, but it's one that's geared towards a certain people. The certain people are the holy people in verse 24. Who would be the holy people that Daniel is being told about? Who are the people that God has set apart for himself? Who are the people that God says, I have chosen? And who is Daniel a part of? The Jews. So at some point in history, there's going to be a Greek who becomes a king out of a Seleucid kingdom to the north, who expands his reign down towards the south, who exerts his power, and in doing so, content is to make them Greek. And in so doing, he is willing to slaughter the Jewish people. Not only that, but we find that he was one who, in verse 23, is described as having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. Now again, Daniel 23, 24, and 25, or verses 23 and 24 and 25 here, have not only a near fulfillment in the description of this little horn, but they have a future fulfillment in application to Antichrist. So part of what we see here about the description of the little horn describes this individual, but he is literally doing things in the Old Testament that are going to be characteristic of the New Testament Antichrist who arises in the future and is yet to come. He has fierce features and understands sinister schemes. Sinister schemes would refer to that which is not only deceptive, but that is which is not only cruel, but that which also is of a demonic nature. You see, part of the description here in verse 24 is that his power is mighty, but not by his own power. There is the power given to him by another. And in the actions that he does here against God's people, it is evident that that power is coming from a satanic origin. So this individual that is a Greek king is an example of what Paul says in Romans chapter 6, that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and power in high places. This is something that we see here where God is saying of this individual, he's a king that arises and is so wicked because he has behind him and is willing to be a pawn of the devil in his sinister schemes. This isn't the only time that we find Scripture referencing the fact that behind the wickedness of man, there is the push of the devil and what he wants. Again, Paul mentions it in Ephesians 6. But in Ezekiel chapter 14, we find that God addresses the king of Tyre. And he describes the king of Tyre and the things that the king of Tyre is doing, and then he addresses the force who is behind the king of Tyre. And guess who we find is the force behind the king of Tyre? King of Tyre is described as saying, I'm going to become like God. I'm going to be seated at the right hand. But that is what the devil has said. So it's not unusual for us to find here then a description of a human who has great power, but that power is given to him by the devil, and he ends up going after anything related to God with intensity. We'll find this to be true of this individual. And he, in doing so, not only is successful, but he prospers at this. And then we find in verse 12, again, Daniel says in chapter 8 and verse 12, that what he ends up doing is he stops the sacrifices in the temple. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground, and he did all this and prospered. So this individual is going to be known for doing something to desecrate the temple. And in so doing, in desecrating the temple, is going to be successful at it. And the Bible mentions a time period of 2,300 days. Okay, so quickly we put together the picture. We got the Greek Empire, established by Alexander, overtakes the Persian Empire. It becomes a great empire. Alexander dies. When he dies, the kingdom is split up into fours. A significant kingdom to the north, the Seleucids, become and reign, and out of comes one who is going to be expanding his kingdom to the south. And remember, in the south, you have the Ptolemy Empire. That was in Egypt. So his move is going to be against the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt. He moves against the east, so he wants to expand beyond where the Persian Empire had been in India and go beyond there. So he's got ambition. And yet, in between the north and the southern kingdom is this kingdom of Israel, and both of them are squabbling over this. That's why he ends up coming against the Ptolemites to the south, because he wants Israel. And what he ends up doing is trying to make Israel Greek. Well, what we can find out from history is this individual apparently was Antiochus, 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 Antiochus the Fourth. Antiochus the Fourth. And he had and took upon himself the name of Epiphanes. Epiphanes is a Greek word which means illustrious one, or describes one who is manifesting himself as being really, really great. In other words, he thinks himself as being a descendant of God or God himself. This term is used actually in the Greek New Testament to describe the manifestation of Christ as the God-man. So Antiochus IV, we're not going to go into all that he is and here, but I want us to identify and understand this is most likely the individual that was talked about. Because we find in the history of Jewish writings, we find in the history of Jewish scripture books that had been written that are not part of the canon, the book of Maccabees, a description of what Antiochus does. And so the next time that we get together, we'll look at a few of the things that he has done in fulfillment of what Daniel describes here. And again, it comes down to fitting like a T, to a T, what God has said. But the thing to remember tonight as we look at Daniel 8 here is that God is giving Daniel this information about the Greeks, because this lays the groundwork for being able to understand that when Messiah comes, this is why people were speaking Greek. This is why the New Testament was written in Greek. This is why it had spread all over this region of the world at this time, and was an effective means of communication rather than trying to do it in Latin, because the Romans were in power at that time. And so he describes the Greek Empire. And we'll again reference this in Daniel chapter 11, the Greek Empire. So remember, the little horn, Daniel 8, is a Greek. The little horn of Daniel 7 is the future Antichrist. And there's some things of the little horn of Daniel 8 that also reference what the future Antichrist of Daniel 7 will be like.